Welcome back to the Deep in State presented by 𝐂𝐡𝐚𝐩𝐭𝐞𝐫𝐬. I'm your host, Nick Hawks. On today's episode, we have Harrison Hines, the co-founder over at Fleek. This episode is sponsored by 𝐂𝐡𝐚𝐻𝐭𝐞𝐫𝐬 Associates, the most experienced DePIN consultancy in the space. We help projects develop strategy, messaging, and token incentives. We'll have a little bit more on us later in the show. Before we get started, make sure you hit the like, subscribe, smash the bell, all the things that help keep bringing great guests like Harrison. To you, Harrison, thanks so much for coming on, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to chat.
Yeah, I'm psyched to have you here. I hadn't heard of Fleek until you guys reached out, so I'm super excited to learn what Fleek is. But before we go there, maybe we start with who are you and how did you come to Fleek?
I started in the industry back in 2016. I originally came in through Consensus. I started a project out of Consensus that was called Token Foundry. We were kind of the tokenization arm of Consensus back then.
Okay.
Through the ICO days. But then I kind of realized after doing that for 2 years and once ICOs started to sort of fall out of fashion, sort of realized I was more interested in the decentralizing the internet narrative more so than the decentralizing finance narrative. So that's when a few years ago I left with a few people I had built Token Foundry with, and that's when we started Fleek.
Okay. And for folks who haven't seen it yet, I was looking at it a little bit before we got on, but what is Fleek? It seems like it's not quite for normal people yet. It's more for like nerds and developers, but walk me through it. How do you think of it?
Yeah, and that's a great point because depending on when this episode airs, we are going to rebrand in the next, not rebrand, but the way Fleek is positioned will look a lot differently because you are right. Right now, it is a little bit positioned as like a Web3 developer platform. And historically, that's what most people know us for. We host, maybe like 60,000 something apps today. A lot of the projects are Web3 apps in the space who use it for things like front-end hosting or storage needs or mostly static stuff. But what Fleek is now, for the last 2 years, we've developed a network where we saw a gap in the sort of infrastructure stack at really the sort of like performance layer, the edge computing CDN, where a lot of Web 2 infrastructure is going. If like moving to the cloud was the big thing over the last 2 decades, moving to the edge is the big thing this decade, largely because a lot of companies and software are chasing performance gains. And so what Fleek is essentially like, it's essentially just like an edge optimized cloud platform. And similar to Uber, we have a different infrastructure layer underneath in terms of a decentralized network that enables us to basically support this use case. But on top, Fleek is just a modern developer platform, not too dissimilar from other modern developer platforms. The main difference is underneath, we're using Fleek Network and other types of Web3 and decentralized protocols to essentially provide developers with the same full stack tools that they have on these modern developer platforms, but just using a different infrastructure underneath to achieve what we think will provide better performance and reliability at a lower cost and sort of without any of the corporate nonsense and kind of being able to keep your self-sovereignty. So that's kind of in a nutshell. Yeah.
Okay. And is this something that a normal person can come in and buy a Fleek box and plug it into their router, or is it something where these are in, fancy server storage or server rooms all around the world, or how does someone participate in this thing?
So I really look at it as like two completely separate sides.
Okay.
Not too different from Uber. So like on the decentralized infrastructure network side, these are just independent web infrastructure operators running nodes. Anybody can participate. You don't need specialized hardware. As long as you meet the specs and you have the hardware that could provide the useful work to the network that is being requested, you can participate. I'd say one difference there is, we don't want to run into this problem we see a lot of other networks have, where you have kind of like 99% unused capacity, because then you're just wasting a lot of money. So we plan to scale the node side of the network a lot more similar to how a Web 2 cloud platform would scale, where we start with an initial capacity, we track usage, and we add capacity to the network as usage dictates we should. And so that's a lot more of a, I think, a better financial approach, because now you're not really overly spending just to claim you have all this capacity. You kind of just grow the network and the capacity as you need it. But on the complete other side is developers.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, as a developer, we've designed the network in a way where we've pretty much eliminated or reduced every barrier of entry or friction point that we can, because it's a lot like, going back to that Uber example. Just because you use a different infrastructure underneath does not mean you need to change the user experience. The only way you could get away with that is if you improve the user experience, which is what Uber did. They didn't only introduce a new infrastructure, they introduced a new way to order a car. And that is really what you need to, I think, accomplish if you want to, like, you gotta, like, yeah, like, it would be really hard, and where we really try to make an impact is on that developer experience side. So using Fleek, taking advantage of this infrastructure, if it is a viable alternative for you for performance or cost or censorship reasons, whatever the case may be, the experience of using the interface of the network, which is essentially like the Fleek platform or other developer platforms who might surface Fleek network functionality, is no different than using any other modern developer platform. That's the idea. Is all the resources on the network are priced in stable coins, so you can pay with a credit debit card on the Fleek platform. We can facilitate the payments to the network on your behalf super seamlessly. So if you don't, and on the new website in a few weeks, these crypto buzzwords, blockchains, wallets, tokens, you won't see any of that. It'll just be, focused on the problems we're trying to solve for developers, the products and services we offer for them to build software and infrastructure on Fleek, and a super seamless developer experience where you don't need to know anything. You might not even know we use Web3 or on-chain infrastructure under the hood. You might just, want to host a website or, deploy an app, and, the rest is, somewhere else if you want to go really into those details, but most developers don't. Yeah.
Right. They just want the thing to work. Okay, cool. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Let's take a quick break to talk about today's sponsor, GoldHawks and Associates. We're a DePIN consultant firm helping projects with strategy, messaging, and token incentives. We run a blog for founders over at goldandhawks.com, produce this show, and most importantly, work with the core teams and communities of your favorite projects in the space to ensure tokenomics and incentives are fully aligned to build out some of the most badass physical infrastructure networks in the world. If your project needs help in any of these, check out goldandhawks.com. So, Harrison, coming back to that idea of who will use it, can you walk me through who you're on the user side, on the developer side, who's your kind of perfect, I guess, customer, perfect user there? Can you describe a couple of them?
Yeah, for sure. And so as part of, the repositioning I mentioned, right now, us, like many other projects or protocols, are targeting this very small 25,000 developer pool of Web3 developers. But there's 25 million developers in the world, and that number has doubled in the last 5 years. And that trend might, with AI, that it'll be interesting to see, but there'll be a lot more people in the world who are building apps and software.
Yep.
And so that's really a huge, 99% of the developer market is largely ignored today, because their infrastructure needs are not met by these Web3 protocols today. It's like their stack is a database, some serverless compute, a CDN, hosting. So they don't need or have an immediate need for smart contracts or data availability or any of this infrastructure. Sure. So we really focus on just building web services that are more traditional, but leveraging on-chain infrastructure and advantages to offer superior products to like just developers. So none of this Web 2, Web 3 bifurcation. Right. Our products and services just are applicable and add value to all developers, because everyone's using Lambda functions, everyone's using a CDN, everyone needs hosting. And so that's really where our ideal customer is, just a developer who maybe is just looking for, easy, out of the box, SEO optimized, super performant way to easily, ship an app super quickly, but get all that auto scalability, all those benefits kind of out of the box. So there's a few groups. You might see a Web3 project And, there's a lot of POCs we're doing with projects where right now, if you want to build decentralized infrastructure, your real only option is to build your own network. And if you look at the whole alt L1 to L2 migration, what largely drove that was the cost and time to market advantages of being an L2 versus an L1. Because an L2 is essentially a virtual blockchain. That's a whole lot easier than building a real full blockchain as an alt L1. And it's expensive. And it takes years and a lot of specialized skills to get to market. So if you think of 𝐒𝐻𝐸𝐿 as being this ability to rent economic security, that is very helpful. But that if we were building Fleek Network as an AVS, it wouldn't have prevented any of the work we've done up to today. You still have to build the whole network. The economic security is kind of like the last mile. Right. And so you could think of Fleek Network as kind of allowing you to rent really performant geo-optimized node infrastructure as a service. So instead of needing to go deploy your own network and dealing with DevOps and infra maintenance and consensus and P2P networking and all this stuff, just rent it. Nobody in Web 2 builds their own infrastructure besides the very big enterprises where it eventually doesn't make sense to stay on the cloud because of, cost reasons or other things. But for everyone else, you rent, especially to start. In Web 3 right now, you have everyone building their own siloed infrastructure networks that aren't geo-optimized. They look like edge networks, but they're not geographically aware. They're allocating work based off of stake amounts or, round robins or things like that. So that's really where we feel, if you look at how Web 3 is playing out, it's all going to modularity, specialization. But this sort of shared performance layer, a layer that sort of like Cloudflare and AWS and Vercel sort of play in Web 2 is missing in Web 3. So that's one category, and we're doing a lot of POCs where it doesn't take long to look at every protocol, middleware, app in the space. They're all augmenting their infrastructure with some sort of Web 2 CDN, Lambda functions. So that's one of our markets, just replacing parts of Web 3 infrastructure stacks from the protocols all the way up to the apps and just running it a CDN replacement instead of Cloudflare, a Lambda replacement using Fleek functions instead. But on the Web 2 side of things, that's where there's that whole category of, people who are using the same types of infrastructure, but maybe they're not so interested for the decentralization reasons. They might just be interested for the performance or lower cost, especially, or just not dealing with the corporate nonsense. You see it every day. There's a new platform that's raising pricing or doing this. So that's why we feel we just want to market to developers. But within that, there's definitely different products and different sort of personas within that we think might use it for very different reasons.
Okay. I got two questions that came out of that. One is a pricing question. One is a geolocation question. Let's do the pricing one because that sounds like it should be a little bit easier. How does Fleek compare to your standard competitor? You guys half price, 20%, 80%? What does it look like if I'm a developer and watching this oh, cool, I'll try it out. How much am I going to save?
We think a realistic target is it'll be at least half as expensive on the compute side. On other resources like bandwidth, it might be kind of similar to start because those costs are largely dictated by L1 network providers and everyone's kind of at their mercy. But in the future, we do think there's some cool P2P stuff we're doing that could offload from needing to do every request from the internet and use local networks and different P2P techniques. But if you look at other networks, like Pocket Network and LivePeer are two great examples.
Yep.
When you compare the centralized alternatives to services like that, let's use Pocket and RPC. Those centralized providers like Infra and 𝐂𝐚𝐸𝐿 are built on AWS. So their costs start at AWS costs. Pocket or LivePeer are primarily bare metal or I don't know if LivePeer is how much it's bare metal, but Pocket is almost entirely bare metal.
Yep.
And their costs are 80% cheaper than Infra, to the point where Infra's free tier of RPC service, they send that traffic to Pocket Network now instead of their own infrastructure because it's cheaper for them to use Pocket than their own. Yeah. So that's really where we think it could be much greater than 50%, but that's the sort of initial target we're going for so that we ensure that the node network can eat, especially as we're growing, usage. Yep. And, it's attractive enough to developers, especially if we can meet or exceed Web 2 performance. We feel like half the cost is, should hopefully get the job done. So I know the foundation is to try to use that as an initial target for some of the pricing. But what I will say is in Web 2, our pricing will be usage based by like force. Like there's only so much you can reliably collect in terms of data about nodes.
Right.
So like we might only be able to charge at a protocol level for things like vCPU seconds or gigabytes of bandwidth served, very low level primitives. Where these cloud platforms really get you on pricing is your job as a company is to try to get your software costs and infrastructure hosting costs as low as possible. A cloud platform's job is to try to get them as high as possible.
Yeah, totally.
So they add all these extra bells and whistles that have nothing to do with your usage of the infrastructure, just to charge you more. And so that's where we could see that we might have really outsized cost savings compared to them on some of these different product and service lines.
Got it. So there's not a bunch of extra on there. Okay. And then I guess the last question ends up being, you talked about the kind of geographically sensitive piece. If I'm in San Diego, but I want to serve content to someone in South Africa, how are you guys ensuring that that happens and that you're not serving it from some server in whatever, New York, that's a little closer, but not all the way there? Like, how does that work?
So the network controls all that, similar to how Uber controls which car, is picking you up. Like the way it works is, you're an app developer, but the people requesting the data are your users all over the world.
Yep.
So that's like where the real magic in Fleek network is essentially like we don't route work based off of stake amount. The token doesn't touch developers. That's like it's very much like a taxi medallion model. That's for the node operators only. The developers or the riders, they're just paying in normal currency. They don't even know the token exists. They don't even know the blockchain exists necessarily if they don't want to.
How do I know that, or how does it work?
Yeah, so basically it's a performance-based reputation score. So once you're staked and you're an active node on the network, similar to having a taxi medallion, then how much work you get is largely dependent on your location, because it's largely where work is allocated to is largely dependent on where requests are coming in from.
Interesting.
So
okay.
If we initially have more apps using Fleek who are US based, like most of their customers are in the US, you might see a lot of request traffic coming from the US. So you might, so it's a free market. So nodes might, go where they see request traffic growing or where there's not a lot of competition. But yes, all work is allocated based off a triangulated location, based off ping times to other nodes, and a performance-based reputation score, which takes into account all the historical data of jobs you were given and how long it took you. And so that's also used to kind of determine location is just request times, pings to other nodes. So that way when a request comes in, if it's in California, we would look for the closest node with the highest reputation or score, and that's who we would allocate the work to.
Got it. Super cool. I got a million questions, but I know your time is super valuable. Thanks a ton for coming on today. We'll have to have you back on to go deeper into it. Folks can find Fleek at fleek.xyz. Is that right?
Yes, the website is fleek.xyz. The handle, it is at FleekXYZ currently, but it's going to switch to just at Fleek in the coming week or two. So by the time this comes out, we might just be at Fleek, but that'll be cool. We're excited for that.
Yeah, that'll be right. Harrison, thanks so much for coming on today.
Thank you very much.